Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon, and what will be the final video in the Reignited Legend series. I've decided to compile all the parts that would have been made into a single upload, mainly so it's all here and there's no waits until parts later. For those who don't know what this is, the Reignited Legend is a community project which I've hosted for a few years now, taking the idea of comments and in video form describing what has now been established as a remake of The Legend of Spyro, all the way from A New Beginning to now Dawn of the Dragon. If that doesn't interest you, feel free to click off. I know there's a few people who feel strongly about this, and as such, strongly tell me how this doesn't need to happen. Some more polite than others, but we won't linger on that. I also want to make this video a little different than the rest. I like to verbally mention those who came up with the idea, as that seems like a better way to shout out and support the ideas that were given. But for the fun of it, and for those who have been waiting years for this, we'll be finishing this off. We start just as the actual Dawn of the Dragon did, in the collapsed Well of Souls, and buried under the rubble and grime lie our protagonists, Spyro, the Purple Dragon, Cinder, the once general of the Dark Army, and Sparks, companion of Spyro. The crystals they were in crack under the weight of the debris, shattering, spilling the three out across the ruins. The first suggestion comes from Kiri Welch, who suggests a moth companion for Cinder, who is the first to awaken the catacombs, prior to being given the magic chain so commonly associated with Dawn of the Dragon. I imagine this playing out as such. To explain how the Gremlins have not yet put the chain on, let's just say that in this remake, Cinder is the first to awaken, as it suggests. The cutscene plays as a moth floats its way to the slumbering heroes. Perhaps it is what wakes Cinder up. Now, this Cinder shares the coloration of her Eternal Night counterpart, as suggested by Saruman. Now, as other suggestions hinge upon the chain, perhaps a tutorial to teach the player basic movement is in order, working them up to using both characters eventually. Its objective is to simply reach to Spyro, a character carried over from a previous Reignited Legend act, and a suggestion by Planeswalker, the Watcher, once again appears. He asks Cinder what she's doing, comments on the moth, a seeming new friend. Cinder simply is confused, still waking up from a slumber she has yet to know the time of. She asks where she is, why the Watcher is there. He doesn't answer. This tutorial teaching the player movement ends as Cinder passes out, and soon the Gremlins come, chaining Spyro to Cinder. This moth follows them, and as they leave, a familiar cheetah picks up Sparks and follows the Gremlins to the catacombs. The game continues as normal. Spyro and Cinder are chained together by magic, trapped as a golem rises from the depths. Of course, in this moment, in the original Dawn of the Dragon, we would see the infamous "Why should you lead?" quote from Cinder, Spyro telling her to follow his lead. Here, however, there might be some more emphasis on resentment, as Blaze Bionicle puts it. This will be later highlighted in Twilight Forest. Now, this resentment isn't to say that she wants to simply run, abandoning this endeavor. In fact, later Taser suggests part of her wish is to right the wrongs she's done in her life. However, such a thing would perhaps not be apparent yet. Of course, there is the opposite of that, as said by Saruman, who speaks of her wanting to run, to flee, and is still afraid of the Dark Master. Perhaps both exist, meaning that Cinder would be more of a nuanced character with these different opinions and suggestions that have been put in. Reaching into the gameplay side of things of this theoretical remake of Dawn of the Dragon, this is where Blaze the Planewalker suggests we could find an expansion on the original game's combat, with abilities combining Spyro and Cinder's attacks. My own thought would be that this could be leveled up, showing more progression and cohesion between the two characters as the game goes on. It's sort of a mix of gameplay and narrative flair, something like that. Now, we switch back to the story. Spyro and Cinder drive the golem back and are found by Hunter, the Moth, and Sparks. From here, the path is familiar. A chase through the catacombs, the golem trying to stop them. It could even be that in the catacombs we start to see suggestions of Sister of Stories, collectibles, armor, and jewelry already scattered in the catacombs and, in fact, the rest of the game. This would, of course, be items exclusive to Dawn of the Dragon, but some, even if small, might call back to the time of A New Beginning or the Eternal Night. Perhaps items from those games, perhaps lore speaking of those times. As suggested by Othello the Poetess, the catacombs and the rest of the game have been expanded as well. Perhaps little details given the remake. Perhaps in tandem with collectibles, each area is expanded in their own unique way, allowing the player to understand and appreciate the area more. Now, what form this takes, I don't know. I'm not a level designer. You can probably imagine how this would go. Feel free to just kind of come up with your own ideas or interpretations of this. Eventually, of course, they find their way out, passing into the Twilight Forest, Zella and Adrano hanging in the starry sky. The protagonists pass through the forest, and there is a scene which was removed from the original game, but is added back at the suggestion of Tidal Vex, perhaps a follow-up to Cinder's resentment of following Spyro's lead. In a scene by the campfire, it's asked why she took such a tone with Spyro. It could be that Cinder simply explains that she once more is chained, quite literally chained to a fate that is not her own. Perhaps somewhere she finds binders that are either similar or maybe even are the same ones that she had beforehand, and puts them on as a reminder of the terror that she might have to face. And the scene goes silent. Of course, in this scene, we get the rather infamous shot, one of the floating layer of Malefor hanging in the sky. That is again shown here, but to invoke more emotion, Saruman comes with another suggestion, that the temple we see, Malefor's lair, is definitively the one from the swamp. The place which birthed Spyro and Cinder, which hid them for so long, now served as the Dark Master's floating palace. To follow this up, a suggestion from a distant wall suggests that Spyro and Sparks might show some worry about the swamp, and this probably plays a big part into it, that they can't help but be worried about their parents, about their home, but before they could probably do anything or say anything to act on it, they are knocked unconscious and dragged to the Valley of Avalar. Continuing on, after the defense of the Cheetah Village, we once again reach a suggestion, another from Othello the Poetess, who suggests the expansion of free flight. Given this is a big part of the original game, and something that greatly benefited the large area of Avalar, it seems like a perfect place to mention such a thing. Spyro and Cinder, along with their companions, could swirl around the trees and plains with various maneuvers, perhaps a type of combination of sorts. But the basic summary is aerial maneuvers are now more or less a thing. Whether or not they affect the gameplay too much, I don't know. Nothing really changes for the Valley, a simple remake. More collectibles added, but the experience remains generally untouched. That is for all but the Shadow Apes encountered near the Hermit, who claims that most of the apes have now been cursed by Malefor, appearing to melt like wax, as suggested by Colby or Vadis. Now, this, in comparison to the actual game, is slightly different. This would mean that there are a small population of apes left, instead of how they are implied or said to all have been cursed by Malefor and turned into Shadow Apes, because of pretty much them wanting to use Malefor instead of serving him blindly. Instead, in this case, some apparently escaped. Perhaps it's the moments following after this encounter, or times of quiet where Cinder begins to reflect. Comments from Colby or Vadis and Rumza, or Rumza, I don't know quite to say that, could be shown here, that she'd speak to Spyro of what it's like, perhaps reflecting on the memories from the Reignited Legend Eternal Night, what she's seen, what she's done, while controlled by Malefor's dark powers. But as they finally leave the valley, they find themselves venturing forth to a new location, a sanctuary under threat, Warfang. When the protagonists reach Warfang, of course, it's in the midst of a battle with Malefor's forces, fighting through the streets and around buildings. In a way to show the battle and its different participants, 2 suggestions from Title Vex and Blaze the Planeswalker could be mixed, showing Spyro and Cinder along with their allies fighting to defend the city. As Blaze suggests, there could be a way of letting allies into a fight, calling more to defend places like the front gate of Warfang and the like. Of course, this wouldn't be all of Warfang. After the fight and the battle is won, additions to Warfang could be explored. As Rumza suggests, perhaps we could see and explore dragons and their civilization here. Through another suggestion by Daniel Mork, we could perhaps do that by seeing shops, museums, art, and places where the dragons lived. We could see the war's effect on these people. Perhaps here in the streets of Warfang, we could finally reunite with the other Guardians, who are helping to lead the civilian population to safety. Terrador, I imagine, would fit this role. In other places, Voltaire could be around libraries, or even meet with the protagonists when they find Ignitus. Perhaps Zero would also be leading, however, in a more pompous way than Terrador. Things that could perhaps give them something to do, as suggested by Title Vex and Colby Orvatis, since they really didn't do much in the original game. They had like a few lines and that's it. Here they're a little bit more active. To connect the older Reignited Legend videos, I imagine here in Warfang, finally we see those like Ember, perhaps Flame as well in Warfang. Perhaps they could, as was in the older videos, lead you to somewhere, or catch the protagonists up to the events not particularly related to the main story. As a way to act on another suggestion by Saruman, we will not have people just ignore Cinder. At least not all. I imagine some might, naturally, given her appearance would have changed since they last heard of her. Perhaps some are sympathetic, perhaps some are abhorred that they're even there. I imagine, however, the Guardians would ask how both her and Spyro were, given their history. I also imagine here would be emphasized a suggestion by Othel the Poetess, where there are more female characters to actually show up in the game. We already mentioned Ember, but I imagine there might be some more here. The trilogy is notorious for having an almost all-male cast, so this seems like a good suggestion to have. Perhaps some could be guards or soldiers with their own stories to tell. Shopkeepers, maybe some could be powerful users of the elements. Other returning characters are also suggested, such as Cain, the Atlawas, who formed friendships with those in this alliance between the moles and the dragons. Hunter and Cain perhaps become friends, which is specifically mentioned, as suggested by Title Vex. My own take on it might see them seeking refuge in Warfang, perhaps something happening to the Tall Plains upon the arrival of Malefor. Following up from the Guardians having more of a role, outside of Ignitus, Voltaire perhaps speaks of the Golem's history. As night falls, perhaps Voltaire speaks of their assumed role in the world. As the suggestion goes, they were peacekeepers. The Destroyer itself actually meant to end all wars, but now is corrupted by Malefor, as suggested by a distant wall. Or perhaps bows to Malefor out of a twisted respect, something turned into a civilization ender, as suggested by Colby or Vadis. In this cutscene would be a suggestion by Trey Bandicoot, of a cutscene showing how originally Malefor was stopped, elder dragons trapping him, and perhaps for whoever is telling the story, a hopeful future of Spyro defeating Malefor. During this Spyro would not quite understand why Malefor simply wanted to destroy the world. He just wouldn't be able to fathom it. As night passes, the plan to travel underground to counter the destroyer and to stop it from completing this belt of fire is made, and the protagonists go into the Warfang underground to give the Dragon Realms a chance to stop Malefor. It's here where we find the mural of Malefor. Perhaps it's still there, but here, in addition to Spyro's comment on it, perhaps the Watcher returns to speak to Cinder. Everyone else is unaware of his presence. As derived from a suggestion of Canicus Palatine, he speaks of it as a time of glory, that the mural depicts a kingdom that could have been, saying it with a type of sorrow. Spyro would look upon it with a different perspective, however, taken from a suggestion by a distant wall, regarding Spyro finding text about the duty of the purple dragon. Gazing upon the mural, perhaps Malefor's place as this revered figure gives Spyro more doubts about his place in all of this, along with the purple dragon's place and its role. The rest of the underground remains the same, however, just with the added expanded areas and treasures to find as mentioned earlier. The dam is in a similar vein. The destroyer is stopped for a time, but unfortunately completes the Ring of Annihilation. The beginning of the end is near. A familiar sight is seen. Spyro, Cinder, and their companions must part. Ignitus volunteers to help them across the belt, to give the Dragon Realms yet another chance at victory against the Dark Master. Perhaps for a moment, the Watcher whispers here and there to Cinder of the folly of this venture. She pretends to ignore, but he still follows to the flames surrounding the burned lands. Ignitus, Spyro, and Cinder travel through the flames of what is, as suggested by later Taser, a sort of dome of fire surrounding the burned lands. In this, though, Ignitus gets across, unlike that of the actual Dawn of the Dragon. What has also been a suggested change from Colby or Vanis is that Malefor ambushes them, and a fight ensues between Ignitus and the Dark Master. Ignitus and Malefor, for perhaps the first time, converse, before the former perishes at the hands of the Dark Master. Malefor flies off, and leaves Spyro to grieve for the loss of Ignitus. This is where I imagine some concept art comes into play, as was the suggestion by Devin Lupe and later Taser. Spyro's grief pulls him into his dark form, and into the mindscape, where Spyro would do battle against his other self. Perhaps here, this battle between Spyro and his dark counterpart is more than just a fight, but also clashing with doubts he's had of his duty as a purple dragon. This fight would see both views, protection and destruction, come head to head amongst the dreamscape. Ultimately, Spyro comes to the conclusion that he should, as all the purple dragons should, protect. There was also a suggestion by Colby Orvatis to have a boss fight of sorts between Cinder and Dark Spyro. Perhaps both could be mixed. Perhaps one stage is Spyro versus Dark Spyro, perhaps another stage is Cinder versus Dark Spyro. Perhaps a cutscene of the fight between Spyro and Dark Spyro amongst the dreamscape is there. And Cinder's fight with Dark Spyro could very well be actual gameplay. Let me know which one you prefer. I think I prefer the first one, but that's just my opinion. As the final touch, Title Vex suggests that depending on who wins the fight, a slightly different ending cutscene plays, and that the boss fight might be a PvP event of sorts if played in co-op. After the fight, Spyro returns to his normal state, and Cinder would do the same as she did in the actual Dawn of the Dragon. Comfort him as he grieves for the loss of Ignitus. Despite the loss, they continue up to Malefor's lair, fighting what Bionicle Blaze suggests would be Titans before they finally reach the lair. I'm not sure if they're referring to golems or not, but perhaps small golems stand in the way between Spyro, Cinder, and the lair. As specifically suggested by Title Vex, Malefor's filter would be turned down in this version, so for the first time you could actually hear that the voice of Malefor is Mark Hamill. Now, the lead up to the fight with Malefor remains somewhat similar, only that Malefor, as suggested by Devin Lupe, would instead choose these specific targets for his speech to Spyro and Cinder. Malefor targets what blood stains Cinder's talons, and all that she's done, perhaps bringing up stories he's heard about her. To Spyro, he takes a different approach, seeing himself and the other purple dragons as these all-powerful beings. He believes that Spyro should become an heir of sorts. Of course, Spyro refuses, and perhaps here you find that Malefor is a little more about power. He's kind of obsessed with it. The corruption of Cinder leads to yet another boss fight, as suggested by later Taser. It gives control of the end to the player. As the suggestion goes, if you fight Cinder, you have to fight Malefor alone. But if you don't, then it's just as the original game plays. The two dragons fight Malefor, defeat him, leading to the end of the game as the world is saved by Spyro. As the end of the game leaves off on an ambiguous note originally, later Taser suggests something more concrete, that the implication that Spyro and Cinder lived is made stronger. Perhaps this would be the entrance to a post-game of sorts, where Spyro and Cinder return to Warfang. While it didn't fit into the main story, it's here where I'm going to put some modified suggestions, mainly just to fit into how the rest of the story went. By Franklin's brother, one that suggests that Spyro and Cinder find Pyra's island, and Pyra himself. He has been canonized in the Reignited Legend, so this would be a sort of conclusion to his story. He would be found, perhaps in a quest, and brought back to Warfang. With the need for a new Fire Guardian, Pyra would be made to become the new one, or at least implied to. As for other post-game related things, many talks about Spyro and Cinder learning of their parents, Ignitus being Spyro's father, as suggested by Title Vex, or introducing entirely new characters to the Reignited Legend from the original trilogy, namely Nestor for Spyro, and for Cinder, Red from A Hero's Tale and Shadow Legacy, as said by Aloragon. I'm not sure where I'd fit that with the actual story. Maybe some part of the lore someone could find, but hey, you know what? Maybe that could be left up to you to decide. I'm just not sure where it would actually really fit in a story that's sort of following the same story of Dawn of the Dragon, just modified a little bit. Perhaps it's also here at the end of the Reignited Legend, Dawn of the Dragon, that we get a reflection on the defeat of Malefor by the Watcher. Hey, maybe this is some sort of like secret ending, get all the collectibles sort of thing. Perhaps they'd wonder what world would have been, but acknowledge now that this new one is in the hands of Spyro and Cinder, and it's up to them to see out the consequences of their victory. Perhaps now, with the threat defeated, Cinder would finally remove the binders that she carried, simply leaving them, as now they're a thing of the past. And the other thing that's a thing of the past is having to wait for another one of these. That's it for the Reignited Legend. Now, there are some suggestions that I didn't put in here. There's a couple of ones that have to do with Skylanders, which I genuinely don't know how to fit in here. I'm very sorry. That's been somewhat of a common thing. There's some other things that I just didn't know how to quite get in, so I'm gonna be honest with that. But now we're here at the end after 3 years. This time I missed Community Day, but now it's out. We're just gonna be happy about that. It's been interesting seeing the different ideas and approaches people have had for The Legend of Spyro and a remake. How kind of consistent people can be about what they want. I mean, I guess that just happens when a community's been waiting for so long. And I've also always been surprised about the amount of people that actually participate in this, let alone watch the channel, so it's definitely interesting. I hope that in some way I did it justice. I don't usually feel like I do, but I just hope it did. I hope that it's somewhat entertaining for everyone that watches. In any case though, that'll be all from me. Thank you for watching this and for those who stuck around for so long. Anyway, a big thank you to my Patreons, Iviso Blue, ConquerFan91, Eric Manuel, Jabby, Kiasu Shin, Lazi, Nightmare Spyro, and Shaggy. I'll see you all around, and I'll talk to you later. Stay safe, historians.